Hi, and welcome to Crash Course Cryptozoology. I'm convinced it's safe to say that the DNA study done at Loch Ness might prove to be one of the most lengthy strides forward in the history of cryptozoology, at least in the history of the case of the Loch Ness monster sightings. I've discussed different aspects of these findings in my previous 3 videos, one of which I actually appeared on TalkSport Radio to discuss the findings in general. I've also discussed what the actual physical findings were, and the reactions to the findings as well. What I've failed to discuss at length thus far, though, is the implications of what was found at Loch Ness. As I'm sure many of you are aware, the only animal that was found to have a significant presence in the loch that has been previously named a possible candidate for Loch Ness monster sightings is the eel. Specifically, there was an abundance of European eel DNA found in the waters. Of course, any finding would have been quite controversial, but this one particularly because it seems so unlikely to those that presume that there are, in fact, Loch Ness monsters that are accurate to what witnesses describe. While I am not here today to vouch for the existence of an unknown species in Loch Ness, or lack thereof, I am here to posit that the discovery of the abundance of eel DNA, coupled with the nature of sighting reports, may actually be far more significant than most are giving it credit for. Specifically, I'd like to talk today about the comparisons and reports compiled by my colleague and friend, Nate Brislin. Nate's perhaps been one of the first people to really point out significant bits of anatomy in eels, especially in European eels, that might hold a lot to say about not just the findings, but about this phenomenon in general. So today I'll be talking about the Brislin Report and what it means for Loch Ness. The report first really started on September 1st when the Ness District Salmon Fishery Board at Loch Ness posted footage of a serpentine object moving through the waters of the loch. Nate had shared the post and commented that the fact that the fishery board wittily mentioned the Loch Ness monster was intriguing. When the DNA study was then published 4 days later, Nathaniel found very interesting bits in that footage compared with alleged photographs, coupled with the new findings at Loch Ness that may prove to be exceedingly significant. For the record, Nathaniel and I run a cryptozoology group called the Association of Cryptozoological Fieldwork and Analysis. Our main platform is Facebook. It was through this Facebook group that we actually shared a video that Nate had produced, which talked about these comparisons. The video was introduced with the following. Only days before the results of the Loch Ness DNA sweep were announced, Scotland's Ness District Salmon Fishery Board captured underwater footage of a long, serpentine object moving through the water. A few days afterwards, scientist Neil Gemmell announced that no catfish, sturgeon, plesiosaur, or shark DNA was found in the sweep. However, an abundance of eel DNA was uncovered, officially making the giant eel theory the most likely candidate for explaining Nessie in terms of an undiscovered species. Throughout nearly half a century, evidence for Nessies has yielded interesting results, the most well-known being collected on expeditions helmed by the late Robert Rines. Some of his photographic evidence, as well as more recent pieces from the early 2000s, have also yielded interesting results in terms of this new DNA revelation. A comparison of several photographs to the Ness District Salmon Fishery Board video shows similarities, particularly in the region of what would be the organism's head. A comparison of these similarities to the European eel is even more perplexing, and shows that the DNA study might be revealing more than we ever could have realized without it. We ask you not only to consider the following video's points, but also to examine the evidence yourself and ask your own questions. I will of course be linking the video that Nate threw together in the description as well as the comments. But to sum up the video, enhancing the footage posted by the fishery board, we find that there is a stark similarity between it and 3 particular photographs from Loch Ness, which the photographers claim to show a Loch Ness monster in. And it is that if we are to look at the subject in the video as an organism, and the photographs as organisms as well, we find that there is a rather robust but narrow face with an underbite, and this underbite has a discolored tip, which is quite interesting because that's a very specific bit of anatomy to be shared between not just these 4 pieces of photographic evidence, but these 4 pieces of photographic evidence that are placed throughout 50 years apart, really, because the Robert Ryan's photo was taken in 1975. The Gillies and Scourge photographs are from 2003 and 2010. Then we have the fishery board footage, which is a recent one, 2019. It should be noted that the fishery board claims that this is most likely a branch in the footage and not an organism. That is more inconclusive than it's being regarded as, especially because of the fact that the object moves in a way that seems like portions of its body are turning, but not the whole body is, which you wouldn't expect to see in a branch. Now, what's interesting about these comparisons between all these pieces of evidence is that European eels specifically have this exact trait. They have this rather narrow head and this significant underbite that usually has this discolored patch at the end of it. It varies whether or not the patch is light or darker than the rest of the skin, but it certainly is discolored. We found that to be quite interesting because of how specific it was. Only 5 days later, the report continued with another very interesting comparison drawn by Nate Brislin. This comparison was also remarked upon by Scott Martis, who focuses his efforts at Lake Champlain in North America. The follow-up read, "Yet another interesting revelation unfolds since the results of the environmental DNA sweep were published last Thursday. Several days ago, consistencies were drawn of a white lip underbite present in several pieces of alleged Loch Ness monster photographs over the past 44 years, as well as in the more recent Ness District and Fishery Board footage. This notable white lip underbite is present in European eels, and it is interesting to point out that European eels, the same species recorded in abundance by the eDNA study, are sometimes recorded as having nasal protrusions, known as anterior nares, and protrusions above the eyes, known as posterior nares. Big thanks to Scott Martis for identifying these by name for us. These nares are connected in order for water to pass through them to help the animals smell underwater. Nevertheless, these are being brought to light as a number of classic Loch Ness monster sightings report two protrusions on the head of the subjects being sighted. Some have thought these protrusions to be horns, eye stalks, and even biological snorkels. One of these reports, perhaps the most popular of these unique handful of sightings, was the 1952 sighting reported by Greta Finley and her son. Mrs. Finley described seeing a 15-foot-long aquatic subject raise its head and neck out of the water, interestingly enough, with two protrusions at the top. Another sighting, and possibly the first of these, comes from Mr. A.H. Palmer in August of 1933. Mr. Palmer sighted a head barely breaking the surface of the loch. The mouth on the head opened and closed, and was also adorned with these small, bizarre protrusions. It is also worth noting that these scent nares are not visibly present in all European eels, nor are the protrusions reported in all eyewitness sightings of the Loch Ness Monster, making these likenesses all the more intriguing. We once again ask that you consider all of the presented evidence and come to your own conclusions. With this post came several photographs of the anterior and posterior nares of eels, specifically European eels, including a very useful diagram of these nares, as well as the eyewitness sketches from the particular sightings mentioned in the post, the Finley subject sighting sketch and the Palmer sighting sketch, with the Palmer one in particular being very reminiscent of the front of the snout of an eel. Scott Martis himself also noted that certain deep-sea eels, such as variants of the moray eel, have extremely protruding nares to the point where some even resemble antennae. All in all, the Brislin Report is an ongoing case study, one could call it, which has thus far yielded more potential legitimacy for the eel theory than any other study has thus far done. The study does not make the claim that therefore the Loch Ness monsters are real, or therefore there are giant eels in Loch Ness or anywhere else in the world. All it states is that there are very striking similarities that have not been given the attention that they perhaps deserve before. And that's a very interesting point to make because, as previously mentioned, a good deal of eel anatomy actually explains the more considerably far-fetched Loch Ness monster reports. For the first time, in a non-monstrous fashion, the classic reports have, to some degree, an explanation. There are even modern investigations into more recent photographs that also seem to yield these very interesting similarities. Of course, none of these photographs are confirmed, but the fact that they all bear resemblances to each other across a significant span of time, and that all of these resemblances are also found in European eels specifically, that's the real significance of the Brislin Report. It would be proper to draw one's own conclusions from these findings and to look further into them whether that's on the end of disproving or supporting them. Because the Brislin Report is about finding the truth. And in finding the truth, whether it gets you further from one idea or the other, you can't ignore patterns. And you can't ignore judging whether they're legitimate or not either. That being said, until next time.